Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? David Engerman is a part of Yale's history department. His area of focus is in 20th century international history. He earned his doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studied American and Russian affairs. During his time at Brandeis University, he published 3 books: Modernization from the Other Shore, American Intellectuals and the Romance of Russian Economic Development, Know Your Enemy, The Rise and Fall of America's Soviet Experts, and The Price of Aid, the Economic Cold War in India. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants such as the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Institute of Indian Studies, and the Guggenheim Foundation. David is the proud father of children who attend New Haven Public Schools. He refers to them from time to time in our seminar entitled U.S. Social Movements Through Biography. We're having a great time learning from him and each other. Thanks, David. We appreciate your hard work and enthusiasm. It's now your turn to take the stage.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here, whatever here actually means in this virtual world. Although, truth be told, I'm actually kind of tired of being here in my home study after a year and a half of this, but so be it. I want to offer special thanks to seminar coordinator Sean. Thanks for that kind introduction. Sean Means and Carol Boynton, to all the participants in my seminar, and from closer to home, Jim Vivian and Stephanie Reed for bringing it all together. As Sean mentioned, I'm teaching a seminar on U.S. social movements through biography, and I wanted to share a little bit about some of the themes that we're addressing here. It's not a full-scale review of the seminar day by day, but a chance to see some of the issues we're exploring. I should note, there are lots of different ways to analyze social movements that aren't biographical. So my aim here is just to add another arrow to our collective quivers as teachers and as historians. I should also note that the seminar syllabus and for this talk set the readings to reflect the interests of the teachers, at least as they stood in the spring. These interests, I think, reflect both kind of long-term efforts to build an inclusive classroom with empowered students, and actually the more immediate reckoning with the American past, especially over the last year. The repeat offenders among you, those who were at last year's National Institute, will notice the close relationship of this topic to last year's seminar. I'd say the seminar is about 50% new, 50% old. And this lecture will operate in roughly the same proportion. So I apologize to those of you for any repetition. I want to start here at the very beginning of our seminar with a quotation from the first paragraph of the first reading from our first session last Monday, referring to a classic advertising campaign of the 1940s and 50s for Teachers Scotch. These ads tell us a lot about the 1950s. Men apparently all bowled and played bridge and golfed and, of course, drank scotch. But these ads also frame the discussion with which we opened about individual experience. The question comes in the form of a provocative, some would say tendentious article that we read by Paul Fussell, a literary critic. Fussell argued against critics of President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 at the conclusion of World War II, and insists that the critics of that decision felt the way they did because they didn't face the prospect of having to be among the soldiers slated to invade Japan's home islands. Fussell had fought in Europe. His unit had actually been signed in spring of 1945 and was undergoing training in the US to prepare for the invasion of Japan. So when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he and his fellow soldiers, he recounts, felt this tremendous relief as if a kind of death sentence had been lifted. And it was hard for Fussell, I think, to make allowance for those not on the front lines. Only those on the front lines, he thought, or destined for those front lines, really could weigh in on this question. Fussell then uses the line, "Experience is the best teacher," from those Scotch ads to highlight the way that his experience offers a special historical insight that no one who wasn't destined for the invasion of the home islands could criticize any of these decisions. Fussell, while he's trying to shut down conversation, in fact, I think opens one up. It invites a conversation about how we think of individual experiences in relation to larger historical processes like wars or, in this case, social movements. Fussell wants us to invoke experience kind of to shut down other possibilities, perhaps like the cranky uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner who insists, I was there, no one else could possibly speak to this. But the premise of this seminar is that contra Fussell, individual experiences open up broader histories. In what follows, I'm going to look at three different topics, ways to, first and most prominently, ways to reinterpret and to teach the civil rights movement. We'll spend a good long time on this. And of course, the civil rights movement is central to American history in its own right, the most important struggle for justice of the 20th century, and indeed the 19th as well. And it's on the single issue that defines, more than any other topic, defined American history and defines the American present. But I'm also interested in looking at the civil rights movement for what it tells us about other social movements in general. Second, we're going to zip back. I'll be violating my historian's oath that I should move chronologically forward in time. We're going to zip back to the late 19th century and talk a little bit about labor unions in those periods and think through the process of what it took to build a kind of collective consciousness. And then we'll zip back to the 20th century, to the mid-20th century, to look at the feminist movement of the 1960s and the role of life stories, biographies in that movement. So let me start, just dive right in with a discussion of the civil rights movement and start out with a problem of historical interpretation and then suggest what biography can do to help address it. We often tell the story of the civil rights movement, so traditionally starting it with the Brown versus Board decision of the Supreme Court in 1954. We look at a rising tide of Black protest in the South that followed that, Montgomery bus boycotts, sit-ins in the early 1960s, et cetera, culminating in the legislative achievements of 1964 and 1965. The Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination by governments and discrimination in public accommodations, everything from swimming pools to water fountains. And then the following year, the Voting Rights Act, which promised, at least until recent years, unimpeded right to vote for disenfranchised. I mean, and it's a very dramatic story over this decade. I've only put in a couple of the events and a few of the photos of the sort of immense change that took place in this decade, undoing, the story went centuries of kind of stasis in one very eventful decade. This kind of narrative of the civil rights movement that goes from 1954 to 65 is full of heroes and victims, heroes at the sit-ins, the boycotts, the victims like Emmett Till on the far right, and of course, far more perpetrators than many Americans care to admit. I won't show Rogues Gallery here, but of course there are plenty of, shall we say, telegenic and photogenic instances on the other side of the sort of effort to slow or stop the civil rights movement. What implications can we draw from this narrative? One implication is that it started and ended with the traditional power structure, the Supreme Court and the presidency. Or to put it a little more bluntly, it's a white guy story that started with 9 white guys in black robes in 1954 who handed down the Supreme Court, a momentous Supreme Court decision, and ended with President Lyndon Baines Johnson finally bludgeoning Congress to ensure that African Americans could vote in 1965. The problem in this story, the problem that these efforts were intended to solve, was legalized and institutionalized white supremacy in the South. And once that was solved with federal power, so the story went, the civil rights had been achieved. It's a story that features high politics, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. most prominently as a symbol, a sentinel, and a voice of the movement. And of course, his role can't be discounted. But we should never collapse this large and broad movement into only his eloquence and his heroism. The movement was both more disputatious within it, lots of different ideas, and more disputed, controversial in its own time. He was hardly seen as heroic or indeed even civil over the course of his lifetime. Self-declared allies kept on asking him to slow down, prompting his brilliant response in a letter from a Birmingham jail. Enemies also tried to slow or stop the movement, threatening and often using physical violence. Enemies within the government tried to break up both his movement and his marriage. And yet, the sort of the memories of the movement as they come down to us are very King-centered, I think, to the exclusion of other currents, of other accounts, of other actors. King's ideas and his soaring language were then deployed, I think, for purposes that he would have, and in fact did challenge. The moving "I Have a Dream" speech, for instance, from 1963, was read to suggest that his goal was colorblindness. And here's some instances of kind of a 21st century American right trying to invoke colorblindness. An African-American conservative, Shelby Steele, quoting, of course, from King's brilliant line, he looks forward to a day where children are seen for the content of their character, not the color, will not be judged by the color of the skin, but will be judged by the content of their character. More strikingly, perhaps, a Restoring Honor rally that took place in Washington in 2010, in August 2010, on the anniversary of the "I Have a Dream" speech. Sarah Palin then invokes Martin Luther King's courage. Glenn Beck went so far as to book a room in the same hotel that Martin Luther King Jr. had stayed at, and then insisted on wearing a bulletproof vest because, after all, King himself had been assassinated, though, of course, not at that event. But instead, I'd like us to think about imagining a bigger civil rights movement, one that started before Brown v. Board in 1954 and continued after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'd like to do this here through the remarkable life history of Bayard Rustin, who was actually the main organizer of the event that culminated in the "I Have a Dream" speech at the March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington in August 1963. Rustin had been one of King's closest advisors in late 50s and early 60s, though he was half a generation older and had been agitating for racial justice while King was still a student. You can see here a picture of Bayard Rustin at the same podium where King would later speak. Rustin, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, penned a stunning essay called "From Protest to Politics." And he wrote here of what he called the classical phase of the civil rights movement from 1954 until his moment, 1964. We could reasonably extend the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He acknowledged, although quite briefly, the heroism and sacrifices it took to get to that point, to these legislative changes. And then he turned a little more somber. "We must recognize," he said, "that in desegregating public accommodations, we affected institutions which are relatively peripheral, both to the American socioeconomic order and to the fundamental conditions of the life of the Negro people," his words. More African Americans, he noted, were unemployed in 1964 than there were in 1954. The racial gap in employment was growing. The income gap was growing. The wealth gap was growing. All in all, more African American students, he said, were in de facto segregated schools in his time, 1964, than they had been at the time of the Brown v. Board decision a decade earlier. In other words, the achievements of the classical phase, however dramatic they were, and however much sacrifice they entailed, only provided the basis for a more fundamental change. Civil rights, to Rustin, was part of a larger Black freedom struggle that had at its core not just the end of government-sanctioned discrimination, not just the right to vote, but the deployment of political power to effect significant change in the material conditions of Black America: jobs, wealth, housing, schools. Indeed, he even said that the civil rights movement was misnamed. It implied that civil rights was the end and not just the means for the freedom struggle. Rustin then saw voting rights as a tool for broader progress. What was this broader progress? This brings us to what one historian has called the long civil rights movement. This is Jacqueline Dowd Hall giving originally a presidential address and an article published in 2004. The long civil rights movement, Hall invites us to look back longer. It helps us see historians to fulfill our professional duty. And I've always joked that historians' job, no matter what the situation, is to say that something started earlier and it's more complicated. No matter what, any particular question, started earlier, more complicated. That's like lesson number one for historians. Doesn't work in the classroom, But here my point isn't to complicate, but to clarify, not to correct the date, but in fact to change the narrative and look at a different timeline of the civil rights movement, one that started before Brown v. Board and continued after the Voting Rights Act. Right? It puts this narrative puts Black activism, not white response, at the center. Black activism by Thurgood Marshall. There's a wonderful essay by one of Marshall's law clerks that just appeared in, it's I think appearing in the Sunday New York Times, who was the mastermind of the NAACP's legal strategy leading up to Brown v. Board, and of course later serves on the Supreme Court. A. Philip Randolph, a labor leader, also figures prominently in this, someone who Bayard Rustin worked for. This longer look puts economic concerns at the center of the story, not political rights, but economic rights. This longer story makes the struggle a national struggle. It was not just against the crushing particularities of the Jim Crow South, but against all forms of discrimination that in North and South limited where African Americans could live and work, not as well as where they could shop. It precluded their benefiting from the major federal programs of the New Deal and the GI Bill. It defined their economic and not just their political existences. This longer story does keep Dr. Martin Luther King here as a hero, not for starting the movement, but for carrying it stirringly in new directions. This version's Martin Luther King is as interested in economic justice as in ending discrimination. His ageless 1963 speech, after all, was given at the March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington, right? It's an echo of a 1941 march planned and then canceled by earlier generations of Black leaders, like the union leader A. Philip Randolph, who demanded hiring opportunities for Blacks in the war industries of World War II. This was part of Randolph's Double V campaign during the war, a call for victory for democracy at home, as well as victory for democracy abroad. This longer version, this long civil rights movement, includes a Martin Luther King who was murdered in Memphis, where he had gone to cheer on a strike of Black sanitation workers in 1968. The movement then didn't end in 1964 or 1965 with federal legislation, but entered then a new phase in pursuit of economic rights, a poor people's campaign that tried to make use of the legislative and judicial victory of the prior decade, to desegregate schools, not just in the South, but also in the North, to use the vote to have a direct voice in Washington and in state houses, and to win economic rights, not just in the South, but also in the North. So what good is biography here? We could recount the long civil rights movement without a purely biographical focus. We could look at the succession, indeed kind of alphabet soup of organizations, NAACP, SCLC, CORE, SNCC, could even add to the list A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a broad vehicle for Black empowerment, Bayard Rustin's Fellowship of Reconciliation. And we could and should follow the rank and file, study local struggles as well as national ones. But biography can add a good deal, right? And here again with Bayard Rustin, we see how he was involved in so many of the key organizations of the classic phase of the civil rights movement, but always had broader targets in mind: economic justice and peace. He founded CORE, Congress for Racial Equality. He later founded the Nonviolent Action Group. He was a not founding father, but perhaps a founding uncle for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He eventually broke with many of these. The NAACP didn't have faith in Gandhian nonviolence, which Rustin kind of, as a Quaker, believed in profoundly. NAACP considered it too passive and weak. Rustin, I think, would show them wrong. To enter the era of politics, as he proposed in 1965, was to enter a period of compromise. And so as the movement radicalized along the very lines he desired, there was less and less mood for compromise. He spent all of his life around these struggles, and indeed many others as well. He showed a lifelong commitment to radical equality for workers, Black and white, And he lived for a time in the shadowy precincts of the far left, although he was a member of the Communist Party itself only very briefly. His commitment to economic inequality was visible through the 1960s with the socialist organization, the League for Industrial Democracy. And he was also haunted by another shadow, that of sexuality. He was arrested in the 1940s for quote unquote sex perversion, otherwise known as homosexuality. And this conviction shadowed his career and kept him out of the limelight, voluntarily or otherwise. In fact, only last year was his offense pardoned by Governor Gavin Newsom in California. So if we're looking for one person to represent the long civil rights movement, and not just its classical phase, Rustin seems to be a natural. Here he is on the left with A. Philip Randolph, one generation of leader, and on the right, of course, with King, another. Rustin was a powerful presence on the front lines of activism of all sorts. He taught nonviolence to Martin Luther King and many others. He was the organizational genius behind the March on Washington. He helped bring into being so many organizations, many of which eventually split with him or fought with each other, but none of these dimmed his enthusiasm and determination. His steady belief in economic justice started long before Brown v. Board, continued all the way till his death in 1987, and he bequeathed to the movement a kind of an intelligence, a commitment that I think is visible throughout this long civil rights movement. Rustin's life offers us a chance to see not just the heroism of what he called the classical stage from 54 to 65, but also the broader aspirations for economic justice that preceded and followed that stage and were visible in that stage, even if we know where to go look for them. Biography, again, isn't the only way to do this, but one of the most powerful and accessible. Now, just briefly here, mention some of the other topics we're dealing with in our seminar: the rise of labor unions in the late 19th century, the feminist movement of the 60s and before. In other days, in fact, today we'll talk about the Gay Liberation Front in the aftermath of Stonewall, the origins of the Native American movement. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss these here. Well, we often think of social movements based on individual identity, African-American, gay, women, Native American, Asian American, et cetera. It's also important to see class as a category for organizing. And here I want to talk about labor unions in the 19th century as a chance to do this. Our discussion of labor unions, and here I'm contrasting two different kinds of unions, one called the Knights of Labor, which rose dramatically up until the 1880s and fell almost as dramatically thereafter. And later, the American Railway Union of the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. The labor unions, a study of labor unions introduces two key questions that we're thinking about in terms of all social movements, but we're looking at. Why is it that this kind of movement came into being at this particular time? Racism, of course, existed well before Brown v. Board in 1954, the Montgomery bus strike the following year. So why did the movement gather such speed at that one moment? And why did it take the form that it did? Right? In the case of labor unions, the roots are as much in the transformation of work and industry in the middle to late 19th century. As of railways, which soon came to produce a dense web, especially over the central and eastern parts of the United States, but in some ways knit the country together. The rise of massive factories that were part of national scale businesses, most notably railways, but also steel, coal, et cetera. These large factories had the power to set working conditions and wages wherever they operated. They hired so many people that they had something resembling a monopoly on employment. These new factories finally buried the old organizations of labor, for instance, those involving apprenticeship or small bosses working in the same community and working closely with the workers. Apprenticeship, even if it didn't offer wages, offered a certain dignity of laborer that was denied in the kind of repetitions of factory work. National employers meant that owners were physically distant in very different cities, but also socially distant. And I mean social distance in its pre-COVID meaning. Even when they lived in the same city, they didn't really interact with the workers. The very conditions of de-skilled work, of lower wages, that made unions all the more important, we looked at, also made unionization possible. Workers were no longer divided along traditional lines of different kinds of work or ethnic background, but they shared similar fates and, in fact, came to recognize their shared fates. This also made it possible for unions to be national. The fates of workers were shared not just in one factory or in one city, but on a national scale. In telling our biographies, in telling this history, we looked at biographies of labor leaders like Terence Powderly, who, as the head of Knights of Labor, was called the Grand Master Workman, and Eugene Victor Debs, the head of the American Railway Union, and in the early 20th century, a perennial candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket. These two figures, Powderly and Debs, represent different stages of union organizing. Powderly's earlier organization, and this, as his title, Grand Master Workman, might suggest, was holding on to older notions of apprenticeship and dignity of work, whereas Debs represented the rise of a more radical approach to organizing labor. This got him arrested, and he actually ran a campaign even while in jail. When he spoke out against World War I, he ends up in jail. He still runs for president in 1920 with a picture of him behind bars saying, "Vote for prisoner number 9653, got over 1 million votes. Finally, I'd like to turn just very briefly to our topic for tomorrow's discussion, the feminist movement. So a bit of a preview for our seminar. Betty Friedan, who is the pioneer who kind of reanimated the women's movement with a publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, was recently, I guess now going back a couple of decades, sort of her biography was told in a very, very different way by a historian named Daniel Horowitz. So Friedan had always presented her biography as if she was one of the suburban housewives who was suffering from the feminine mystique. But what Daniel Horowitz showed was that Friedan was actually part of, shall we say, a long feminist movement, one that might fill in the troughs between the so-called waves of feminism, a first wave and a second wave, with the second wave in the 60s. The first wave culminated in the 19th Amendment, the right to vote would no longer be abridged on account of sex. And the second wave that emerged in the 1960s with the creation of the National Organization of Women, now led by Betty Friedan, among others. What Horowitz showed was that Friedan's liberal feminism which focused on opening up opportunities for professional women to enter mainstream journalism, politics, and business, focused on ending discrimination in the workplace. This actually began for Friedan with a more radical commitment to workplace equality. Friedan, Horowitz shows, early 1950s working as a labor journalist, where she wrote pamphlets for the United Electrical Workers, including a pamphlet shown here, UE, as the union was called, Fights for Women Workers. At its peak, in the decade after World War II, right about when she wrote this, UE had about 600,000 members, which made it the largest single communist-run organization outside the Soviet bloc. Now, there's a great irony here. Horowitz is celebrating Friedan's hidden history of radical, a history that she very carefully disguised from feminine mystique and in her later conversations and recollections. But Friedan got word of this biography, a biographer, and seemed to think that she was being red-baited. So when she got wind of the project, she tried to sabotage it. She refused Horowitz's permission to use her papers. She declined interviews. She tried to forbid her friends from speaking with Horowitz. And then she rushed out her own biography, Life So Far, which refers, I think, disdainfully to others trying to tell her story. Never mentions Horowitz by name, doesn't dignify him with that, but is clearly profoundly upset that someone else is trying to tell her story. So with these three kinds of cases, I hope I've given a chance to see how different angles and angles of entry, shall we say, into the study of biography. I'd also like to mention just very briefly another that we connected with this, and we did this actually in our first readings in April, May, reading a book by Sam Weinberg, shown here from Stanford University Ed School, Why learn history when it's already on your phone? What Weinberg is promoting here is a form of inquiry-based learning. And inquiry-based learning, of course, is not relevant only to biography, but biography is as good a means as any for encouraging students to investigate, even interrogate the past. I won't dwell on this here, but what Weinberg's calling us to do is to shift our historical instruction from informational to inquisitive, to have students ask questions about a topic and, guided by teachers, learn to answer them, focusing less on teaching the facts of history, which after all are all on our phones, and more on the skills of how to be a historian, right? There's a classic article from a historian of the 1930s called "Every Man His Own Historian." And here we're seeing every person, every student becoming their own historians. And this sort of inquiry-based learning, I think, is really one very straightforward way to get at this is through biography. So I could go on, but I think I'll stop at this point and hope I've given at least some sense of the power of biography as a tool for understanding social movements and for teaching about them. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yep.
So my understanding is, and maybe somebody from my state can help, they've made new laws and are saying now that we're not allowed to teach about race. And they're going to limit how we can teach about race. And Krista, have you heard of this? She looks frozen on my screen, so I'm not sure. So I'm just maybe suggestions of books that we could use that are going to be about race inevitably, but aren't teaching about race by chance, as far as
that we can't teach about race. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. So I'm obviously going to teach about race. It's not going to not happen, but just wondering if you would have any suggestions for books for that book.
It's a big challenge. I mean, there are these laws coming in Oklahoma and elsewhere against teaching "quote unquote" critical race theory. But I should say here that nothing I've mentioned here, either any of our readings or so on, would carry that banner. The problem is that critical race theory is now being used by its opponents and could expand to mean just about anything. So, I mean, I would say that one of the best, I mean, first of all, I would strongly recommend this article, The Long Civil Rights Movement by Jacqueline Dowd Hall. You have access to it through your Yale accounts, and it's just a good way to start. It's full of references. The Long Civil, let me see if I can pull up the slides for it. Long Civil Rights Movement. Take me a second here.
Okay, yeah, I saw that on there before.
Here we go. Let me just quick share this screen. The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past. So I would suggest that. It also lists not dozens, but hundreds of citations. It's a little old now, so there's plenty more on it. But I think the idea is that you can, if you resort to teaching "quote unquote" teaching the facts, right? That you're just going to teach, you're going to add to the story of 1954 to 65 by teaching about other episodes. For instance, rather than start the struggle for school desegregation, start it with Brown v. Board, you can start it with Thurgood Marshall in the 1930s, who launches a kind of decades-long campaign that culminates in Brown v. Board. And there are a number of decisions. I think one of the key ones is actually in Oklahoma that says, because the law of the land of that day was Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896, which was separate but equal, that you could have separate educational systems as long as they were equal. Now, of course, that was never the case, but Marshall's strategy was to actually hold states to the separate but equal, not to tear it down, but to hold states to it. So, for instance, if there's a Black med student who's qualified for medical school, then the state was obligated to provide an education for him that was that was equal to the education for white medical students, for law students, or other cases, right? And so there's a series of, since law is based on precedent, Marshall was trying to establish these precedents that didn't overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, but actually called for it to be more strictly adhered to. And then this eventually provides a basis to launch the larger assault, right? So you could teach a case like that is simply just teaching a case. It's not imposing a kind of critical race theory, whatever that may mean, view on it. So I think one of the ways to do it is just to focus on different kinds of events and have the students work to connect the dots. It gets more controversial to look at the post-1965 issues because you're now Martin Luther King is sort of far outflanked on the more radical side by Malcolm X, by Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, et cetera. But even if you just kept the focus on King, you could talk about the Poor People's Campaign. You could talk about the Memphis sanitation workers strike, right? So you can stick to a kind of just the facts, ma'am, approach, and just use those, and then you can have the students connect the dots. Does that make sense as a way to do it?
Absolutely.
I do feel like all of you are facing different challenges. That's a very different challenge than university teachers, any university teachers at Yale or anywhere else would face. So I think it's worth consulting with experienced teachers exactly on how to navigate the particular circumstances. And of course, these laws, which probably won't hold up in court, will be enforced in different ways. In different places. So I would definitely encourage kind of conversations at the local level about how to navigate this. But I think at the national level, just, at a more general level, just teach new facts as well as, right? You're not challenging any of the old ones directly. You're just adding other material for students to learn about and think about.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'm curious, David, you've read lots of biographies, obviously. Which one or two have been your favorites or most influential, or what rises to the list?
I would say two. One recent one, which I hope doesn't come across as a shill for my colleague and neighbor, David Blight, who has a stupendous biography of Frederick Douglass that just came out now 2 years ago, won the Pulitzer Prize. And it really is a true kind of intellectual history of him. Another one actually is a great biography by John D'Amelio of Bayard Rustin. And I should also mention there's a wonderful documentary called Brother Outsider about Rustin. Another biography Horowitz biography of Friedan, I think is very interesting, although it doesn't rise, I'm sorry to say, doesn't rise quite to those heights. One of the most influential biographies for me for a long time was a biography by the Harvard historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich called The Midwife's Tale, which it's about the early 19th century, I think, New England town. And she finds this very, very sketchy and incomplete diary of a rural midwife, and applies this remarkable historical knowledge to both tease out the meanings and what that life was like, but also really to retell the history of early American towns. And so that would be another.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say, Tina, thank you for trying. Thank you for finding a way. It's very different in DC because our population in most of our schools is 98-ish% African American. Some schools are a little bit more diverse. And we have a completely different way of showing perspectives. I didn't even know that critical race theory was an issue until I went camping recently, and in church at the campsite, it came up in discussion, and they were very much against it. So I dove into research about finding out what it was and realized how manipulated, thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Engerman, that information could be. And so I am nervous about the state of things, but it is comforting to hear, Dr. Engerman, that it is not something that seems like it would be upheld. But I do appreciate.
I'm not an attorney. I'm not an attorney, but I'm hoping.
Right. I just do appreciate that there are teachers out there that are trying to figure out how to properly give students information while still making sure that they're in alignment with curriculum. And so I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, we've had that issue, and I did a cultural project last semester, and it turned out really, really well. And we studied social movements, we studied feminist theory, and I'm an art teacher, so we did do the civil rights movement and the workers movement, and then made art based on it. And one of our board members came in and she was like crying. She was like, "Oh my God, this is so beautiful. It's student voice." And they really did make it really personal. So, like I said, I'm not about to stop teaching about race. I mean, it's important. I think it brought out a lot of things with the students. So, I mean, that's what we're here for. So we have to teach that. We have to.
And I applaud you as an art teacher who is finding ways to integrate into everywhere, because that is also so very awesome.
Just to kind of add on to that and that conversation, we had an art teacher at our school who also used, and I think biography is such a great medium to do this, right? Because you're learning about a particular person, and maybe it's a person in art or a person in a certain social movement. And through that inquiry base, right, then kids are asking their own questions about that person's life and realizing, oh, this person has gone through these other historical events and has encountered race issues and race tensions in this way. So you're not necessarily teaching about the race and the racism that they may have been involved with. You're teaching that particular person and their biography for your means of art, but it gives them that kind of avenue to start asking questions. And if their conversation leads in that direction, what do you do as a teacher but mediate it, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna add like one thing that just, that came up in our seminar about, what can we teach and, what can't we? And one of the things in my own reflection is like, I don't think like throughout my career, I've ever had an issue with, what I taught. I don't remember like how many times the principal came in and just like, "Yo, I heard you were teaching XYZ. You can't teach that here." And I know that probably might be different, if I was out in like maybe a suburban district or something like that. But I think that, has kind of really put me at ease with, what I teach in my classroom. The questions have always been like around behavior, or maybe, some type of administrative stuff, but never has it been, what are you teaching and, why are you teaching this? So not to just, I guess the point is not to get all, worried about, because those people that are creating that legislation, like those people aren't coming into your classroom, I don't think. Like, so that was just a way of like thinking about things and put it in perspective.
And my principal likes the way I teach, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're good. Like,
Still, I live the philosophy of CYA and make sure you can validate everything, because the principal may not care, but if one parent complains about one conversation to the right person above your principal, that person is going to come in. And so, you just have to be very, very careful, because you don't know who knows who. You don't know whose child is who, what their political affiliations are, but more importantly, what their affiliation is with this particular piece of legislation, because I think that could be anywhere. And just be very, very careful. I have had friends I'm a science teacher, and I have had friends come under the gun with evolution and teaching evolution and how it was taught. And so just be very, very careful. And even if it's not a part of the curriculum, I've had parents complain, not me personally, but I've had friends who've had parents complain about creationism not being taught in the classroom to, say, a superintendent, and then a principal wind up being in their classroom observing out of nowhere. So just CYA, make sure you do exactly what Ms. Usan said, and just be very careful. Tread lightly, because I don't want any awesome teacher to lose their job or to have extra stress because they just decided to fight the system and do it anyway when there's a way to CYA.
I had a question regarding what you were saying about figures like Martin Luther King being quoted, or I guess it makes more sense to say misquoted about the idea of color blindness. And my sound's been a little wonky today, so I didn't get to quite hear everything that you said. So I apologize if this question was answered. But I feel like, especially the last maybe 20 years or so, you know, I can remember personally, and I'm sure a lot of you do too, when schools first started observing Black History Month and teaching about you know, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, I feel like the party line was, you know, exactly that, quotes from the I Have a Dream speech of, you know, everybody kind of getting along together. But in reality now, the more that I read about it, it seems like that concept was sort of manipulated to be more palatable to, I guess, the white population. What do you think that people like Rustin and MLK and other figures would say if they were here today and could kind of see the way that Black History Month and, you know, the civil rights movement has traditionally been taught?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough. It's hard to say. Rustin went through a number of different iterations and changes over his last couple of decades, and of course even those when he died in 1987. So I wouldn't focus as much on what they would say today, but one of the things I would do is try and look at why is it this speech that gets canonized and repeated. I mean, it's a brilliant speech, so on that basis alone, right? It's available widely on YouTube. If you haven't watched it, it's just really extraordinary, as opposed to some of his other speeches. Why do I look at this speech? So one of the ways to do this might be to take a different speech of his, one that talks more about economic justice, or talks about when he eventually came out in opposition to the Vietnam War, right? And so you can look at two speeches and say, why do we remember this? Why is this one? You know, what are the different implications of teaching King through this speech versus through another speech? In fact, we did a little exercise about this on Friday, not about Martin Luther King, but about the Langston Hughes poem Harlem, which I think many people would recognize as, you know, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, ... or does it explode? But it turns out that the Yale Library, the Beinecke Library, has drafts of that poem, and it was part of what was called a montage of dreams deferred, I think. And you can see in there him working out other, you know, what that poem meant in relationship to other poems, which are also very, very good, but aren't the ones that we read. So you can essentially teach a little bit about what you might call the canonization. How does something end up in our canon and not other things? And what we came to as a conclusion, I think on Friday when we discussed this, was the Raisin in the Sun poem makes no reference to it being African-American. It's an experience that all of us from whatever background can share, in that we've all had dreams deferred or knocked down or challenged, right? But then you read the other two poems and you see how centrally African-American it is. One in historic terms about the arrival of people from not just the American South, but from the Caribbean and elsewhere into New York and heading up to Harlem. And then this third poem, which kind of offers a direct enumeration of what it meant to be Black in Harlem in the middle decades of the 20th century when he writes the poem. But there you can teach these kind of in contrast, and you can teach the process of canonization in a way that's just asking students to interrogate how is it that this poem comes down to us and not others, right? And the same would go for King's speeches or for particular figures as well. And so that's a way to kind of invite students to challenge not your authority as a teacher, but the authority of the textbook as because the textbook is making all kinds of decisions about what to include or not. The kind of curriculum guidelines, whether detailed or briefly outlined, are also making these kinds of decisions. But you can ask students what the implications are of teaching it this, learning it this way versus that way, through this poem or this speech rather than that poem or that speech. I should also just note as a plug for the Beinecke Library that the website has a lot of these drafts of the poems with a little analysis online, and they're accessible to anyone, so it could be readily used in the classroom. If we were in person, we would have gone in and seen the actual physical drafts, the papers he was writing on. In this case, we didn't get that privilege, but we at least got to think about the questions we'd want to ask about the poems and to understand them in draft after draft.
I just wanted to ask you, who would you think the leaders of the women's movement are now? Unfortunately, even, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, a lot of of course, Gloria Steinem is still around, but would you have any women to suggest that are leaders of the movement now?
That's a tough one. I mean, first of all, I'm a historian, and so I read current, about the women's movement today as I do about anything, as a citizen rather than as a scholar. I think we've seen a kind of a dispersion, as happens in most movement. That there's a certain degree of unity at a certain moment, although it actually didn't last all that long for the National Organization for Women. And now there's just so many voices speaking, and the sort of the kind of call to intersectionality, right, to understanding the diversity of women's experiences, I think has been really valuable intellectually, but more challenging politically to have a single leader in a single organization that speaks for it. So to my mind, it's a much more complicated question, perhaps, than it used to be, because our understanding of the world is taking better account of these than they did, and there are kind of all kinds of blind spots. Some of which were being, moments of being suppressed, where Betty Friedan tried to purge the National Organization of Women of lesbians, who she called the kind of lavender menace, or just were kind of forgotten or omitted in the interest of a focus on one or two people. So I'm a little hard pressed. I wish I had a better answer to that question now, but I do think the fact that there is no one person who comes to mind suggests something about how the movement has changed. And that's a teachable, in itself is teachable.
We are coming to the conclusion of an hour. So I think it is time to thank you, David, for your talk very much.
Thank you all. Good luck with the curriculum units, and I'll see you in my seminar in a couple hours. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, David.